The morning sun spread over Maplewood like a soft golden blanket, touching rooftops, fences, and the quiet corners of the small town. Claire Dawson stood alone in her newly built guest house, surrounded by blank white walls that made the place feel more like an empty shell than a home. She had dreamed of this house for years, a quiet escape after her divorce, a place to rediscover herself. But now, 2 years later, it still felt unfinished, lifeless, and far too quiet. That morning, she was waiting for a painter she had hired. His name was Ethan Miller. She'd found his profile online through a local community page. Everyone who reviewed him mentioned two things. He was reliable, and he had an eye for color that made homes feel alive. That was exactly what she needed, not just someone who could paint, but someone who could bring warmth back into her space. At 9 sharp, she heard a truck stop outside. Through the large front window, Claire saw a man step out tall, broad-shouldered, wearing worn jeans and a white t-shirt flecked with paint stains. He moved with quiet confidence, carrying his tools with one hand. There was something calm about him, something that made the air around him still. When he reached the porch, she opened the door. "Mrs. Dawson?" He asked politely, voice deep but gentle. "Just Claire," she said with a small smile. "Come in. The walls are waiting for you." Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The way he looked at the walls, the light, even the shadows made it seem like he was reading a story only he could see. "You've got a beautiful space," he said softly. "It just needs a little warmth." "That's the idea," Claire replied, folding her arms, pretending she wasn't nervous. He nodded, then began unpacking his tools. He moved with easy rhythm, spreading his brushes, tape, and paint trays like a musician setting up before a show. Claire tried to focus on her laptop at the kitchen counter, but every few minutes she found herself watching him. There was something soothing about the sound of a paint roller gliding up and down the wall. Something peaceful in the way he worked without rush or noise. When lunchtime came, she offered him coffee and a sandwich. He hesitated, then accepted, wiping his hands clean on a cloth before sitting on the porch steps beside her. The air smelled faintly of paint and pine trees. "So, how long have you been painting?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "All my life," he said, gazing at the horizon. "My dad was a painter, too. I helped him on jobs when I was a kid. Guess it stuck with me." She smiled. "That's nice. Doing what you love. I mean..." He chuckled quietly. "Most days, yeah. But it's not about loving it, it's about what it gives back. You fix things. You make something better. That feels good." His words lingered in her mind. Claire hadn't thought about fixing things in a long time. After her divorce, she'd built walls, emotional ones, not just the ones in the guest house. She didn't want anyone fixing them. Yet something in his tone felt genuine, like he wasn't talking about paint at all. The rest of the day passed quickly. Claire went back to work inside, but she couldn't help glancing his way. The afternoon sun poured through the windows, and she noticed how it caught in his hair, turning it gold at the edges. Every brushstroke seemed thoughtful, patient, as if he was painting with purpose rather than speed. By evening, the first coat of color was done a soft golden beige that made the room glow. When he stepped back to look at it, Claire joined him. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's just the base," he replied, still studying the wall. "Once the light hits it tomorrow, you'll really see it." She turned to him, wanting to say more, but unsure how. "Thank you," she said finally. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and smiled. "You don't have to thank me yet. It's only day one." That night, after he left, Claire walked through the guest house slowly, her footsteps echoing softly. For the first time since she'd moved in, the place felt warm. Not finished, but alive. She found herself standing near the window, looking out toward the road, half expecting to see his truck again. The next morning, Ethan arrived early. Claire was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard the door open. "Morning," he said, smiling. "You start early," she said, handing him a mug. "Best light in the morning," he replied, taking a sip. "Can't waste it." They worked side by side that day. She organized things, cleaned corners, even helped him tape the edges of the windows. They talked more about music, about small-town life, about the strange comfort of routine. Claire learned that he had moved to Maplewood 5 years ago after his father passed away. Painting homes had been his way of staying close to what he'd learned from him. And though he didn't say it directly, she could tell he carried quiet sadness to something that made her want to listen. To understand as the days passed, the walls filled with color and Claire's world began to shift. She laughed more. She found excuses to check on the progress, to bring him coffee, to ask meaningless questions that somehow led to conversations that lasted for hours. The silence that once haunted her house now felt alive with his presence. One afternoon, she walked in just as he was finishing the largest wall in the living room. The sunlight poured across the new color, turning it golden like morning light after rain. Claire stopped in the doorway, staring in awe. "You've completely changed this place," she whispered. Ethan set his brush down. "It wasn't the place that needed changing," he said softly, his eyes on her. "It just needed light." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Something about his words touched a quiet part of her heart that had been closed for too long. She wanted to say something, but all she could manage was a smile. That evening, they stood on the porch again, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The light made everything glow: the sky, the walls, even his tired hands. Claire felt something new stirring in her chest, something both beautiful and frightening. "Will it be done tomorrow?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Almost," he said, "but I can take another day if you'd like." She looked at him, realizing he wasn't talking about work. Her heart skipped. "Another day sounds nice," she said softly. He smiled, nodding slightly before packing up his tools. "Then another day it is?" After he left, Claire sat by the freshly painted wall, running her hand over the smooth surface. The warmth of the color matched the warmth spreading quietly inside her. She didn't know what was happening or what it meant. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. That night she couldn't sleep. Every sound reminded her of his quiet laugh, the way he spoke about color like it was alive. She thought about the loneliness she had lived with, how she'd convinced herself she was fine being alone. But maybe, just maybe, she was ready for something new. The next morning came with soft rain and the sound of his truck pulling up again. She watched from the window as he stepped out, looking up at the sky with a half smile, as if even the rain couldn't ruin his mood. When she opened the door, he grinned. "You sure you still want me working today?" "Rain can mess with drying." She nodded. "I don't mind. It's nice having someone around." He paused for a second, studying her expression, then gave a small nod. "Then let's make it count." As the rain pattered softly outside, Ethan began painting the final wall. Claire sat nearby, pretending to read but really watching him again. The room smelled of rain, fresh paint, something she couldn't quite name, something that felt like hope. When he finally finished that afternoon, the walls seemed to glow even in the gray light. Claire stood quietly, heart full, words lost. Ethan wiped his hands, then turned to her. "There," he said with a gentle smile. "It's done." But she didn't look at the walls. She looked at him. And in that moment, she realized something had already begun, something that couldn't be painted over. As he walked out that evening, she watched the truck disappear down the wet road, feeling both gratitude and an ache she hadn't expected. The guest house was no longer empty, and neither was her heart. The next morning brought clear skies and the smell of damp earth after last night's rain. Claire opened the door of the guest house to let the air in. The walls gleamed softly in the morning light, fresh, bright, and full of warmth. It didn't feel like the same house anymore. It felt like it had been waiting for her to come. Alive again, Ethan arrived soon after, carrying his usual bag of brushes and tools. He smiled when he saw her standing at the doorway, her hair loosely tied, coffee mug in hand. "Looks like the rain helped the paint settle perfectly," he said, walking in and glancing at the walls. Claire nodded. "You were right about the color. It feels alive." He looked pleased. "That's what a home should feel like." As he unpacked his tools, Claire found herself hesitating. Now that the work was nearly done, she didn't know how to feel. Each day he'd been there, The place had felt warmer, not just because of his work, but because of him. The thought of the job ending made her uneasy. So she began casually. What comes after this project? Another house. Ethan paused, glancing at her. Yeah, a restaurant downtown hired me to do some mural work next. It'll be different, but I'm looking forward to it. Claire smiled politely, though her heart sank a little. You do murals too? Sometimes. My dad taught me to always see a wall as a canvas. Whether it's plain white or covered in color, it tells a story. His words made her chest tighten. Everything about him was simple, yet thoughtful. She realized she hadn't met anyone like him in years, someone who spoke quietly but meant every word as the day went on. He worked on the final touches, corners, trims, and small details. Claire helped him clean up between coats, trying to hide how much she enjoyed being near him. Their conversations flowed easily now, filled with laughter and small memories. He told her about growing up in Oregon, fishing with his dad, and learning to mix colors by eye. She told him about her move from Boston, her previous career in marketing, and how she'd left everything behind to start over. Why Maplewood? He asked. She thought for a moment. Because it's quiet. And I needed quiet. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Quiet's good, he said softly. It helps you hear yourself again. For a moment, the room fell silent, the air between them thick with something unspoken. Then he smiled faintly and went back to painting, leaving her with a racing heart. By late afternoon, the work was done. Ethan cleaned his brushes and began packing up his tools. Claire stood nearby, watching him with a bittersweet feeling she couldn't name. She wanted to say something, anything, to keep him there a little longer. Would you like some tea before you go? She blurted out. He hesitated, then nodded. Sure, that sounds nice. They sat on the porch again, 2 cups of tea steaming between them. The trees rustled in the soft breeze, and the scent of rain still lingered in the air. For a long time, they didn't speak. It was comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Finally, Ethan looked at her and said, You know, I've worked in a lot of houses, but this one feels different. She tilted her head. Different how? He smiled slightly. It feels lived in, even before it was finished. Like it was waiting for someone who'd really see it. His words struck something deep inside her. For years, Claire had felt invisible even in her own marriage. She had lived in rooms that looked perfect, but never felt like home. But now, standing here in this small guest house with a man who saw color the way she saw emotions, she felt seen again. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. Thank you, Ethan, for everything, she said, trying to sound steady. He nodded, meeting her eyes. It was my pleasure, Claire. Their eyes held for a moment longer than either expected. Then he gave a small nod and walked away. She watched him drive off, her heart heavy yet full. That night, Claire sat in the guest house with a book, but couldn't focus. Every brushstroke on the wall reminded her of him, his patience, his calm, the quiet strength in his voice. She wondered if she'd ever see him again after today. It felt wrong that something so warm could end so suddenly. The next few days were quiet again. Too quiet. The sound of his footsteps, his soft humming while he worked, all of it lingered like an echo. Claire busied herself with decorating, adding curtains, plants, and small touches, but the place felt incomplete. Not because of the walls, but because of the absence of the man who painted them. On the 4th day, she decided to visit the restaurant he'd mentioned. She told herself it was just curiosity that she wanted to see his mural, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. The restaurant was on the corner of Maple and Oak, an old brick building that was being renovated. Through the open doors, she saw him standing on a ladder, painting a tree that seemed to grow right out of the wall, its branches twisting into shapes that looked almost alive. His focus was absolute, his movements deliberate and graceful. When he saw her, surprise flickered across his face, followed by a quiet smile. Claire, he said, climbing down, didn't expect to see you here. I was in the neighborhood, she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. I wanted to see your work. He looked up at the mural, then back at her. What do you think? It's beautiful, she said softly. It feels like it's moving, he chuckled. That's the goal. Art should breathe, right? They talked for a while, just like before ease, comfortable, unforced. When he mentioned grabbing coffee after finishing his shift, she agreed before even thinking. At the cafe. They sat by the window, sipping coffee and watching people pass by. Claire told him about her plans for the guest house, how she wanted to turn it into a small retreat for visitors. It's a place for quiet weekends. Ethan listened carefully, encouraging her with small nods and thoughtful questions. You've got the right heart for it, he said finally. People will feel safe there. His words warmed her. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it with honesty and gentle conviction. Over the next week, they met several times. Sometimes at the guest house where she asked him for advice on decorating. Sometimes at the cafe where their conversations stretched into hours. What started as friendship began to carry unspoken feelings, soft glances, smiles that lasted a beat too long. The quiet comfort of two people finding something unexpected in each other, but neither dared to say it aloud. Claire was careful. She knew the world could misunderstand an older woman and a younger man. Ethan never pushed, never made her uncomfortable. We showed quiet respect and warmth that made her feel alive again. One evening, after helping her hang paintings in the guest house, Ethan stood back to look at their work. The walls were now complete live with color, art, and meaning. Claire stood beside him, feeling proud but also afraid. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded. You did this. No, she said, turning to him. You brought it to life. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The silence between them heavy with emotions they both understood but couldn't express. Then he smiled faintly and said, Sometimes walls aren't just walls, Claire. Sometimes they reflect what's inside us. Those words stayed with her long after he left that night. She lay awake, heart pounding, realizing she couldn't ignore her feelings anymore. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper, something real. But she also knew how fragile it was, how easily it could be broken if misread. A few days later, Ethan called. Claire, the restaurant mural's finished. I wanted you to see it before it opens to the public. When she arrived, the mural took her breath away. The painted tree now had roots that extended across the wall, intertwining with bright colors that symbolized growth, hope, and renewal. At the bottom corner, she noticed something small painted initials. Her heart caught when she realized one of them was hers. She turned to Ethan, speechless. He looked down, a shy smile tugging at his lips. You inspired it, he said simply. I wanted to leave a piece of your story in it. Her throat tightened. Ethan, I don't know what to say. Then don't, he said softly. Just feel it. And for the first time in years, Claire let herself feel everything, the fear, the hope, the warmth, and the strange joy of being seen again that night. As she walked home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, her heart felt full, yet uncertain. She didn't know where this would lead, but she knew one thing. Ethan had filled more than her walls. He had filled the spaces she thought were empty forever. Still, a question lingered in her mind. Was it just inspiration for him or something more? The answer, she knew, would change everything. The days after Claire saw her initials in Ethan's mural passed like chapters in a dream she wasn't ready to wake from. Everything seemed brighter. Mornings felt softer, evenings warmer. But beneath the calm was confusion, a pull she couldn't name. She knew what she felt, but she didn't know if she was allowed to feel it. Ethan still visited sometimes, helping her with the finishing touches on the guest house. They'd talk about small things, the garden, the weather, art, and books. Every moment felt easy, natural. Yet between their words lived a quiet awareness neither could ignore. One afternoon, Claire was tending to the flowers near the porch when she heard footsteps. She turned to find Ethan standing there with 2 cups of coffee and that same calm smile she'd come to know. You look like you could use a break, he said, handing her one. She took it, smiling softly. You always seem to show up when I need a break, he laughed. Maybe I just have good timing. They sat together on the porch steps, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Ethan said quietly, "I got offered a new project. In Seattle." The words hit her like a sudden wind. She tried to smile, but her voice trembled. "That's wonderful. You deserve it." "Yeah," he said, though his tone didn't sound excited. "It's a big opportunity. 6 months of work. But—" he hesitated, staring into his cup. "It's far." Claire nodded, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell him not to go, to say he meant more to her than she'd expected anyone to again. But she couldn't. She wasn't sure what right she had to say it. Ethan glanced at her. "I've been thinking about what you said about making this guest house a retreat. I think it's a beautiful idea. You've turned it into something alive." Her eyes met his. "You helped me do that." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's yours now." For the rest of the afternoon, they worked quietly side by side. He fixed a window frame. She arranged new curtains. Everything felt normal, but it wasn't. It was goodbye, disguised as an ordinary day. When evening came, Ethan packed up his things. As he reached the door, Claire finally spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "Will you come back?" "After Seattle." He paused, meeting her gaze. "If you want me to." The simplicity of his words pierced through her restraint. "Of course I do." He nodded, his eyes soft but unreadable. "Then I'll come back." And then he was gone. The weeks that followed were long and still. Claire threw herself into work, painting, decorating, and preparing the guest house for guests. It was finally open, and visitors began to come. Couples looking for quiet weekends, writers seeking inspiration. All of them said the same thing: "This place feels peaceful." Claire always smiled and thanked them, but inside she knew why. Ethan's presence lingered in every wall, every brush stroke. She missed him more than she wanted to admit. Sometimes she'd stand in the guest house late at night, running her hand over the walls, remembering his voice, the calm in his tone, the way he saw beauty in everything. 6 months passed slowly. Then one morning, as she was setting flowers on the porch, her phone buzzed. It was a message, a simple text from Ethan. "I'm back." Her heart raced. She didn't reply immediately. She couldn't. Instead, she read the message over and over, feeling a rush of emotion she hadn't felt in years. That evening, as the sun began to set, she heard a knock on the door. She didn't have to ask who it was when she opened it. Ethan stood there, slightly tanned, a little tired, but smiling in that familiar, gentle way. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she whispered back. For a few moments, neither moved. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." He looked around the guest house and smiled. "It looks even better than before." "You taught me well," she said. He laughed, then grew quiet. "I thought about this place every day in Seattle." Her heart pounded. "You did?" "Yeah. Every wall I painted there reminded me of this one and of you." She didn't know what to say. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Ethan." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You changed how I see things, Claire. You didn't just give me a job, you gave me something to believe in again." Her breath caught. "And you gave me life again," she admitted. "I didn't even realize how empty I'd been until you walked into that door with a bucket of paint." They stood there, the air thick with emotion, the unspoken words finally breaking free. Then Ethan said softly, "I don't want to just fill walls anymore. I want to build something that lasts." Claire blinked, her heart aching in the best way. "With me?" He nodded. "If you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind that come when something broken inside you finally begins to heal. "I'd like that," she whispered, over the following months. They worked together, not as client and painter, but as partners. The guest house became more than a business. It became their shared dream. They added a small art studio where visitors could paint and express themselves. Ethan taught classes on weekends, and Claire managed the bookings, and decor people loved the place. They said it felt different, that it carried a kind of peace that couldn't be explained. And maybe it was true, because love, when quiet and honest, has a way of filling spaces without being loud, but it wasn't always easy. Claire still worried about what people would think. He was younger and she was rebuilding her life after years of disappointment. Sometimes late at night, she'd ask him, "Do you ever wonder what people might say?" Ethan would smile and reply, "People will always talk, Claire. Let them. They don't know the story behind the walls." Those words became a kind of promise between them, a reminder that what they shared was built not on impulse, but on trust and healing. One spring morning, they stood outside the guest house, watching a group of guests leave, waving goodbye. The place was thriving. The walls that once stood empty now held laughter, music, and stories. Claire turned to Ethan and said, "You know, I hired you to fix my walls, not my life." He chuckled. "Guess I'm bad at keeping things professional." She laughed too, shaking her head. "No, you're perfect at it." He reached for her hand, a simple, natural gesture. "Then I'll take that as a compliment." For a while, they just stood there, watching the sunlight dance through the trees. It felt peaceful, steady, the kind of happiness that didn't need grand gestures or promises, just presence. As time went on, the guest house became known as the Painted Haven. Travelers loved its warmth, the art, the calm energy. Some even said it had a story in its walls. And they were right, because behind every color, every brushstroke, was the story of two people who met by chance and ended up saving each other quietly, beautifully, and without ever breaking a single rule. One evening, as they closed up for the day, Claire looked at the wall Ethan had painted last, a soft mural of open windows and sunlight. "You know," she said, "this place isn't just a guest house anymore. It's home." Ethan smiled, pulling her close. "That's all I ever wanted it to be." And in that moment, surrounded by the colors of their shared journey, Claire realized something simple but profound. Sometimes love doesn't come in fireworks or chaos. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments, in paint-stained hands, in laughter over coffee, in walls that once stood empty but now held life. She had hired him to fill the walls. He had filled her heart instead, and this time she knew it was built to last.